Millennial or Gen Z? Whenever it comes to different generations, when you're born right on the cusp of the next generation kind of turning over, it can be confusing which category you fall into. And while ultimately this is not really an important thing, some people born in the late 90s or early 2000s maybe have asked themselves, do I count as a Zoomer? But if you can remember through the year 2001, specifically the September attacks in New York City, there was a massive and immediate shift between how things were before and how things would be afterwards. Here's a picture of me and my brother in August 2001 in New York City. I remember this trip, and being born in 1994, I reckon most people, give or take a year or two around my age, remember how things were before and just how things seemed different afterwards. But that's not ultimately what this video is about. Like we said, 2001 was a pretty big turning point for a lot of things. So many things globally were just changed after the events of 9/11. The video game industry was similar. A lot of games would be delayed, canceled, or altered strictly off of sensitivity for releasing in a post 9/11 world. It's an interesting but significant time in gaming history that is often not really talked about or discussed in relation to what the world was feeling at that point. And there are a few videos out there that talk about games affected by 9/11, but in our research, we found a lot of instances. Grand Theft Auto 3 is probably one of the biggest games people look to in this subject. Not only was Rockstar Games headquarters in New York City, miles away from Ground Zero, but 2001 was a pivotal year for Rockstar as Grand Theft Auto 3 was set to release in fall of that year, making it the first Grand Theft Auto game to make the full jump into 3D. It was highly anticipated, and a lot was on the line with this game. With the game originally set to release less than a month after September 11th, the game would end up ultimately getting pushed back 3 weeks. As with the fallout of the 9/11 attacks, Rockstar was faced with a lot of decisions they would have to make with what to do with their game. With Rockstar's main offices being in New York City and Grand Theft Auto's fictional city, Liberty City, being based directly off of New York City itself, or at least heavily inspired by it, Rockstar founders Dan and Sam Houser had even been cited in interviews to say that they were wondering after the attacks if they even wanted to release the game at all, just to prevent comparisons with terrorism. After the attacks, Rockstar's offices were inaccessible for a few days due to the mass amount of roadblocks scattered all over New York City, but ultimately the decision was made to push the release back a couple of weeks to give the development team a little bit of time to go through the game once more and attempt to make changes to the game to prevent further comparisons to New York City and to make other pretty big changes to not release a game that maybe played into something that would come across to the public as like really tone deaf. On September 19th, 2001, Terry Donovan, who is Rockstar's managing director, actually stated to IGN that they felt that a full content review of all of their titles and marketing materials that they used to represent them was absolutely necessary for them, and that they had come across certain small contextual references that they were no longer comfortable with, as well as a couple of very rare gameplay instances that no longer felt appropriate. Right away, what became evident was the main box art for the game would actually be changed for the North American release, though Europe still got this version of the box art. And if you look at pre-release screenshots of the game, you can see that the LCPD police cars had a blue and white coloration originally. However, the color scheme would be changed to a more generic black and white design after the events of 9/11 to kind of distance itself from the blue and white coloration used by NYPD, especially since during this time, many public servants had tragically lost their lives trying to save other people, and in the Grand Theft Auto series, law enforcement typically play like an antagonistic role, so Rockstar made this decision to try to distance themselves a bit more, while people were still mourning the September 11th attacks. In the game itself, they also went on to make quite a few changes in the few weeks that they had before they ended up shipping the game. Apparently, there was a flight path of a plane that was altered, just so when you were playing the game and you looked up at the sky, it didn't ever look like the plane was flying towards any buildings, even though the plane would have never actually flown into a building. They wanted to avoid that altogether, so the flight path was changed pretty significantly. There was apparently an entire level of the game that was removed that had references to terrorists. Along with this, there was some dialogue in the game that would omit the word terrorist, or radio talk that would use the word terrorist from time to time was also altered. Here are some examples of like lines that ended up being altered for the radio where they're like reporting on the stories as to what just happened in the GTA 3 world. Like Like, for instance, in the original, the line, "and no group, terrorists or otherwise, have claimed responsibility," would be altered to, "and no group has claimed responsibility." Here's another example of a news report that was altered. "Leaving few witnesses, several dead officers, and a bridge itself severely damaged." That would be altered to, "leaving few witnesses and the bridge itself severely damaged." And then another line that was altered was, quote, "that followed the initial attack, although police drivers have yet to find any remains," which would be altered to just, "that followed the initial attack." Then there were some lines of dialogue that were scrapped altogether, like this one. "In a statement made earlier today, Mayor O'Donovan made it clear that the police were treating this as a terrorist attack both on Liberty City and its citizens." It is also rumored that some buildings were altered what their appearance would look like to remove any resemblance to the World Trade Center, though there aren't any pre-release builds or renders that would show what these buildings would have looked like, so we don't know for certain what buildings were altered. There was also an interesting advertisement for Grand Theft Auto 3 that would have been used where it was just like, yelling about typical ammunition type things, and there was a line where they would say, "register to win an anti-aircraft gun actually used when we whooped Saddam's ass." This would get unused and scrapped on the final release of Grand Theft Auto 3. However, Grand Theft Auto Vice City would reuse part of this advertisement, though having part of the script rewritten for it, changing Saddam's ass to Australia's ass. It seemed like there also might have been a level with a plotline involving suicide bombers. In an earlier German trailer, you could actually see that it would have originally been possible to blow up airplanes at the airport, and that would result in a 4-star wanted level. However, in the final release of the game, missiles actually pass through airplanes, which makes it impossible for them to be destroyed. And while it's impossible to know some of the changes that were made, whether they were a direct result of what happened in New York or if they were just other last-minute changes, overall violence and gore was slightly toned down in the final release of the game, as body parts wouldn't be as explosive without putting a cheat code in first. And this, in later Windows releases of the game, would actually be set as the default. So it likely was put as some sort of intentional, reduction of gore. Driver 1 was a pretty amazing game back in the day. I mean, this was what we had before GTA. I mean, you just drove around, it was really cool. But here's the interesting thing, besides the fact that this game had an incredibly difficult first mission. I mean, you had to do all these tricks in a short amount of time. It was hard. This game also was affected by September 11th, even though the game came out before September 11th. This game originally launched in June of 1999. However, the game was successful and the game would continue to be printed and sold at stores for quite some time after the launch of the game, and the game would also be released on other consoles, specifically computers, in 2000. But if you look at the box art of the game here, you could see the blue car that's wrecked, the dude's face that, I don't know. I mean, look at them. And then you see a little city skyline in the background, and you can see where I'm going with this. After the events of 9/11, these two tower buildings, which I think is based off of New York City. I'm not 100% sure that this would in fact be the Twin Towers. Is that how the skyline lined up? I think maybe it is. Nonetheless, just to not have to worry about any comparisons, because there is a level that takes place in New York in the game, they decided to just remove the entire city aspect from the box art cover of the game, and the game further on when printed would have just this box art instead. No city in the background. Not as fun, but hey, they did what they, I guess, had to do. I don't know. I feel like this one, I mean, I don't know. I feel conflicted. On one end, I know, the emotion and sensitivity that was kind of around during that time. A lot of people had that sentiment. It was a painful time in America, but I don't know if this would be something to be really offended over, especially since the game released years before. There wasn't an oversight where they used an old skyline picture and applied it. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Now, I recently did kind of go into a little fix where I was playing a bunch of Driver 1 just to reminisce a bit. And interestingly enough, the Twin Towers are still in the game, which I never realized back in the day that they even were, but you can see it on the skyline in the background if you pay attention, because they just took pictures of New York and just pasted it on the background. But you can actually drive to real locations, and the Twin Towers are still in the game. I mean, back then they didn't really release updates, so that makes sense. But interesting that they decided to take it off of the cover, but it still exists in the game. Later on, Driver Parallel Lines, which takes place in the 70s, would release release and also let you drive around New York, and you can also visit the World Trade Center in that game as well. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 is another game that's kind of notoriously known for having a level in the game changed because of the events of 9/11. This game was set to release October of 2001, and as some of you may remember, if you had Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 back in the day, there was the infamous airport level. Now, it's not the most famous airport level in all of gaming, but hey, it was still up there. Now, of course, if you're unfamiliar with Tony Hawk games, there's usually a list of objectives you can do in a level, and you have a timer, and you have to go and complete the level objective, and then you get rewarded for it, and it counts as like the main progress for the game. So there was an interesting concept planned that I can understand why they wanted to change it right before the launch, just considering the timing of this game's release in close proximity to 9/11. But in the airport level, there was a quest line where you had to stop terrorists. According to series producer Ralph D'Amato, he recalled that the original objective was to stop terrorists from bombing airplanes, and when September 11th happened, they had to scramble to rework the objective so that the level still would have objectives and work, but, you know, kind of change the theme of the overall quest here, I guess. So instead of bombers, they changed the terrorists into pickpocketers, and this is a little bit of an interesting choice, but it's kind of clever. I think it works here for a last second change. I mean, they had to think on their feet. Why not switch it to stopping pickpocketers in the airport instead? Now, there are a couple of interesting things, like the model found in the game files still is called Terrorist A, and it's obvious that this change was done kind of last second. The pickpocketers actually have a pretty short animation. It almost looks like they're pressing something in their hand, like a detonation device or something. I don't know. I mean, I guess they're grabbing the phone. And then they hold money up in their hands, which I guess is something that you could like pickpocket. This causes the other NPCs to like run away, and then like the pickpocketers start screaming, and it's weird because you don't think like, I don't know, if you're trying to pickpocket, you're trying to be like inconspicuous. You don't steal from someone and then a foot away just start yelling at the top of your line. I mean, maybe you do. What do I know? What do I know? My experience pickpocketing is non-existent. Also, all the pickpocketers are dressed exactly the same way. And they're also pickpocketing in some of the weirdest locations that I've ever seen. The Tony Hawk fandom wiki page actually points out that one of the pickpocketers can be found in the women's restroom. So, oof. Now, maybe you've already heard about this one, but I do think it's interesting that there's still other little remnants of what the objective would have originally been. Like, for instance, if you go to the bigger metal detectors, you can see that the metal detectors have the text "No Bomb 2000" on them. I mean, it's clever. It's just, pre 9/11 time when this was in development. But hey, the game still ended up earning $77 million in revenue, and you could play as some really cool characters depending on which version of the game you're playing on, like Darth Maul. Vert. He's a vert guy.
Now, this next game is actually kind of what inspired the whole idea for this video, because in our last video, we talked about Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro, which still is a crazy name to me. What do they mean by entering Electro? I don't know. I didn't play the game, so I don't know how Spider-Man does that, but I hope he doesn't do it the way I think he does. Nonetheless, this game was supposed to have a big final ending that would take place on top of the World Trade Center. And with the original release just being scheduled 1 week after 9/11 on September 18th of 2001, they had to make some changes. Obviously, they couldn't just have a big boss fight on top of the World Trade Center anymore. So what they ended up doing is pushing the game back a month to give the developers time to alter the game. First and foremost, they would change the final stage on top of the Twin Towers. They would kind of add a bridge, and those were connected buildings, so they still kind of resemble the Twin Towers, but obviously the Twin Towers didn't have a big bridge in between. But they would also have to alter other things for sensitivity reasons, which included some changes to level names, like Crash Flight, Downward Spiral, Aces High, and Top of the World became Wind Tunnel, the Corkscrew, the Gauntlet, and the Best Laid Plans. Now, eventually, the pre-9/11 version of this game would leak online in 2015, and people were able to download the ISO as well, and you are able to play the unaltered version, if that is something that you're interested in. I mean, it is an interesting piece of history. It is not quite clear how this uncut retail copy surfaced online and how someone got their hands on it. There's a lot of like sources claiming that the game was recalled from shelves, but I don't think it ever hit shelves. They immediately stopped it from hitting retail shelves following the attacks. There's also some lost media attached to this game. There was a promotional cutscene from the game that was published on the website for the game prior to launch, and the cutscene apparently contained Spider-Man and Thor meeting after the final battle. So I wonder if that cutscene would have also had the Twin Towers in it. But that cutscene is considered lost media, and nobody has been able to find it. So if you remember this cutscene and you randomly have the file, get it out there.
The Syphon games are kind of a now forgotten game series that existed back in the day, but more interestingly enough, there was some decisions made in regards to Syphon 3 back in 2001. 1 week after 9/11, there were letters containing powdered anthrax spores that were mailed to several news outlets and 2 US Senate offices, which caused widespread fear and panic during a time where the public was already pretty anxious with what just happened in New York days earlier. And these attacks with anthrax would continue over several weeks between September and October. The first letter was postmarked September 18th, 2001, but letters continued to be mailed out containing anthrax all the way into October. Major media outlets like ABC, CBS, NBC, the New York Post, and even the National Enquirer received letters, and 2 letters were also sent to Democratic Senators Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy. These letters contained incredibly threatening notes referencing death to America, death to Israel. There was a lot of suggestions that they were religiously motivated and maybe linked to terrorism. And sadly enough, 5 people actually died from inhaling anthrax spores. 17 other people were infected but ended up surviving after receiving treatment. This was a really, really big deal at the time, but there was so much going on already in fall of 2001 that this didn't get as much press as obviously the September 11th attacks, but it was still a pretty big scare to an already anxious public. There was initial suspicion that foreign terrorists had been involved in sending these letters out, especially considering the closeness in the timing between September 11th and these anthrax attacks. And while this was a serious issue that happened in 2001, Syphon 3 changing their box art because they thought that the cover art was too reminiscent to the anthrax scare coming right off the heels of 9/11. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I'm being insensitive and I'm not trying to be, but I feel like this isn't really like drawing any comparisons whatsoever. Like I could understand other games that we talk about in this video, but this one just... I don't know. This ended up getting changed to this, and that was the story of Syphon Filter 3. As far as who was actually sending those letters in the US during this big anthrax scare, the FBI in 2008 concluded that the perpetrator likely was Bruce Ivins, who was a US Army microbiologist who worked at a government biodefense lab, and he actually worked with the FBI to investigate where these anthrax attacks could have been coming from because he was regarded as a skilled microbiologist. But the whole investigation was a pretty wild ride. The FBI seriously thought it was some other guy, and then when leadership on the investigation shifted, Ivins finally became a suspect. By 2008, Ivins was already being treated for depression and was apparently struggling with his mental health. Police actually found him unconscious in his home. He was sent to a hospital before being involuntarily committed into a psychiatric hospital. Then apparently during a group therapy session, Ivins ended up making some non-denial denials when the discussion about the anthrax attacks would come up. By summer of that year, investigators even informed Ivins that he was likely facing prosecution for the alleged involvement in the anthrax attacks. The Los Angeles Times actually did an investigation and found that Ivins stood to profit from the attacks because he was a co-inventor of patents for a genetically engineered anthrax vaccine. The rest of this case is a pretty wild ride. Ultimately, Ivins committed suicide before he faced trial. There's still a lot of conspiracy theories out there. The FBI conclusively declared that Ivins was solely responsible for the attacks, though there has been criticism for the FBI in the way that they handled this case, along with calls for further investigation to be explored. But in recent years, it doesn't seem like anything has gained traction. Wild story, though.
Now, obviously, all the games we've talked about in this video, we're gonna talk about in this video, have been affected by 9/11 in some form. But one game game that was profoundly impacted was Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty. Scheduled for release in November 2001, Metal Gear Solid 2 faced immense challenges just 2 months before launch. The game, which features themes of terrorism and takes place in New York City, had so much about it that would seem insensitive just 2 months after the attacks, that Kojima and his team entered what he described as crisis mode. They consulted with lawyers and stakeholders, and they identified over 300 points in the game requiring revisions just 2 months before release. Notable changes included removing scenes of Arsenal gear, which was like a massive fortress that crashed into Manhattan, and had added references to terrorism out of the dialogue. When Kojima would talk to Konami's boardroom and explain the plot and explain the changes they had to make, the board was actually considering completely shelving the project entirely. Kojima himself actually later would say that he thought the game shouldn't be released at this period in time. He said that he has no other choice but to take responsibility and resign from the company. So that's how intense this whole situation was, that Kojima almost was forced by himself, and I mean maybe the board, to resign before Metal Gear Solid 2 even would release. But actually he said himself that Konami's founder, Kagemasa Kozuki, and the Sony Computer Entertainment president of the time, Ken Kutaragi, actually both urged Kojima to continue the project and just go ahead with the revisions and still release the game. Now, after they completed the revisions, the game was only delayed by a few weeks. Obviously, when the game released, it became critically acclaimed, and everybody like loved this game. It's probably one of the greatest games of all time from like an artistic perspective. But there's so much that they changed about this game that you kind of wonder how would the game have been if the 9/11 attacks had never happened. Obviously, we'll never really find out, and we just know a few details about these 300 revisions. And it's kind of insane that it only took a few months to implement these revisions. Twisted Metal Plague initially was a PS2 game that released prior to 9/11 in June of 2001 for the PlayStation 2. This game took the franchise into like a darker, more mature direction and completely changed the tone compared to the predecessors. Now, while this game released prior to 9/11 in the US, it was planned to release later for other markets. And with the way this game was very violent in a lot of ways, like there was a lot of endings that were explicitly over-the-top violent that could be seen as offensive, following the attacks on 9/11. They would end up toning them down in the other regions, even if they didn't directly relate to a terrorist attack or anything like that. What was more directly related to 9/11 was this scene, though, where an actual airplane, like a commercial airliner, crashes on one of the levels. Now, this drew direct parallels to what happened on the September 11 attacks, and so they obviously didn't feel like they could keep this in the other releases that were in December of 2001. Now, instead of the plane crashing, the plane was just already crashed when you load into the level, and the area that was freed up once the plane crashes was just accessible by default. Apparently, this made something called a jet fatality bonus impossible to achieve, which also is a crazy thing. Also, before I was recording this, I went to my local game store and I actually looked at the American box, and it actually has like the plane crash sequence as one of the advertisements in the back. So that's actually also kind of crazy. That obviously was also changed for the European and the other releases. And that wasn't the only kind of like 9/11 connection that Twisted Metal had. Actually, when Twisted Metal 2 came out in 1996, there was a level set in New York, and actually you can see the skyline of New York, and the Twin Towers are actually missing, and you can only really make out the Statue of Liberty, which you actually shoot at in the level, which obviously at the time in hindsight was also a crazy level, even though it happened like 5 years prior. But obviously they didn't change anything of that. I just thought that was an interesting fact that they kind of predicted it, or I don't know, it's just really eerie.
Much like what we already talked about with Driver, Project Gotham Racing similarly actually had a small revision made to the game's box art. Now, originally, the game, which was set to release in fall of 2001, had the World Trade Center in the background of the box art. However, obviously, after the events of 9/11, they decided that they wanted to update the box art for the game. Thus, the World Trade Center was not visible in the actual box art. Interestingly enough, though, the old box art was still released limitedly because the game had already gone gold at that point. So there are versions of Project Gotham Racing with the original World Trade Center box art still out there, even though the game came out after 9/11. Microsoft didn't rush to panic switch things out. They just decided in later prints of the game they would update it. Obviously, after the September 11th attacks, there was a lot of announcements regarding games that were changing or just switching things up for how they were going to release their games. Another one of these games that was altered, obviously, in the wake of 9/11 was Microsoft's Flight Simulator 2002, which was set to release in early October 2001, though in September 18th, 2001, Microsoft announced that they were going to delay the game. Ultimately, the game still ended up releasing in October, just towards the end of the month instead, and there were some changes made to Flight Simulator 2002. One of the big features of Flight Simulator 2002 was going to have like these realistic sceneries and locations. It was a pretty big jump technologically. I mean, if you look at what the Flight Simulator before Flight Simulator 2002 looked like versus what Flight Simulator 2002 looked like, it was a pretty big technological leap or advancement. And obviously, with New York being one of the environments that they wanted to have shown off, the World Trade Center was originally going to be featured in the game, though with everything that happened, they did update the game before the release to remove the original World Trade Center from the scenery there out of respect for the victims. Still, nonetheless, after the wake of September 11th, surprisingly enough, flight simulation games, specifically Microsoft Flight Simulator, would actually come under extra scrutiny about like the involvement of flight simulation games and like the access to people being able to learn how to fly airplanes. It was a weird time. Local news apparently even covered it in some areas. Matter of fact, there was a community called AV Sim that was really popular in the earlier flight simulation days, and they had an annual conference that was planned for October 2001, which they would cancel in the wake of September 11th as well. Now, I wasn't too sure about what AV Sim was, so I had Luke look into it a little bit, and he did find some interesting stuff about what it was like back in the day.
Well, AV Sim was basically just like a community forum for flight simulator nerds and such. And after the September 11th attacks, they actually would end up turning their data into the FBI in the unlikely event that terrorists used the AV Sim forum to download like any of the mods or any of the files that they had hosted on their website to plan the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. So the community itself, they tried to come together and host like virtual memorials in the flight sims and like memorial fly-ins and, some stuff for charity. It was a wild time in 2001.
The flight sim community actually had quite a bit of kind of disruption after the September 11th attacks. There was a sim developer, Laminar Research, and they were set to release an X-Plane 6, and that was supposed to come out on September 17th, 2001. X-Plane was like another sister game to Flight Simulator. It wasn't quite Flight Simulator, but it was its own thing, but it similarly falls into this retrospective section. And they ended up releasing the game, but they made the active decision to have no hype or fanfare with the release. They were just going to release it, and then they like set up their whole website. It's a very 2001 website that was kind of a tribute to the people of New York. Also, there was another development studio, Terminal Reality, who had the Fly game series, and they also would condemn the attacks, and they even released a downloadable patch that would remove the Twin Towers from their pre-existing game.
Personally, I always thought it was weird to remove the Twin Towers.
Like retroactively, like after the game's already out. I felt that way too. I don't know. It's one thing if it's like a level maybe that like...
Yeah, but if it's just part of the skyline or something...
yeah, especially when the game's already been released. Yeah. I feel like it's a little weird. But I mean, people didn't know how to react back then or what the backlash would look like. It was an unprecedented event. But still, definitely now, it is interesting. Okay, I just saw a crazy video.
How crazy are we talking?
Well, okay, let's just back up a second. Just for reference, if you're watching this video at this section of the video, a lot of the time, Luke and I get into calls, we talk about stuff, and then, we kind of edit it together and make the video that you guys see. But sometimes like we're looking some extra stuff up that comes into mind that we're like, oh, what would this be? And Microsoft would add an update for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2000, which was the previous entry, which would remove the Twin Towers from that game as well. But they also removed this video clip.
John, you just about crashed into the Empire State Building.
Hey, that would be cool.
Folks, have fun in your flying, and by all means, please,
stay out of the trees.
It's insane. I mean, it's just unfortunate, but it's insane.
That would be cool.
I mean, there was a plane crash in the Empire State Building, right, at some point?
Was there?
Yeah, like a smaller plane.
I understand why the joke wouldn't fly, no pun intended. Do you think Microsoft drew more attention removing that clip?
Yeah, but I mean, then you never know. What if they left it and then someone, got salty about it? But I guess this was the 2001. People on Twitter didn't get
Fired up over silly things.
Yeah, everything. But I don't know. Also, did you hear the end of that clip?
Which one? What part?
It said, "Stay out of the trees."
Oh.
I think you should take that advice, because every time I see you play Flight Simulator, I just see you crash into the trees.
Dude, also, I love how at the end of the video clip, they just stare at the camera and then it freeze frames. But like, they are...
So, SimCity 4 would release in 2003 and would not feature the World Trade Center, which is interesting because both the previous games, SimCity 2000 and SimCity 3000, which released prior to 9/11, would have the World Trade Center in it. Now, even though SimCity 4 released in early 2003, there was still files in the game where they originally had planned to put the World Trade Center in that game, and you are able to restore it through modding, and you are able to show that they initially had plans for the World Trade Center in this game. So obviously after 9/11 they decided to cut it as well, even though it's already programmed. When they would re-release SimCity 2000, SimCity 3000 and SimCity 4 on like the DS and on mobile devices later on, they would just cut out the World Trade Center out of SimCity 2000 and SimCity 3000 as well. So they would alter these pre-9/11 games and take out the World Trade Center out of them. But I mean, once again, if you mod those games, you can restore them as well, because they're still in the files. I guess I didn't do a good enough job to completely delete them.
Now, I found a little bit of complexity with the game Eternal Darkness. This game is often cited on like different pages as a game that was altered because of September 11th, though maybe I don't know enough about Eternal Darkness specifically. Sorry for shaking my desk constantly also and making the camera shake.
Yeah.
So Eternal Darkness was originally shown off at E3 2001, and there was a demo where you could explore the Forbidden City, and this character named Joseph de Molay was supposed to be in the game. He was supposed to be a tome bearer, like a Templar Knight type guy. And this is where things get a little bit vague, because maybe, once again, I'm not super familiar with Eternal Darkness, but apparently the chapter that would have had this character and this whole arc that was shown off at E3 ended up getting cut out of the game, and the September 11th attacks are the reason that it's often cited for being cut out of the game. A little confused on that. At the same time, Eternal Darkness did also have some other things that were altered by the time the game would release, like Arabic writing would be removed from the game, and a few other little changes along the way for sensitivity. But yeah, this one just really intrigues me. I don't fully understand it, but if anyone out there knows a little bit more about Eternal Darkness and can maybe make the connection, maybe leave it in the comments down below. We'll like the comment if someone can figure it out for us. That'd be neat.
Oh, sorry. Ace Combat 4 ran into an interesting scenario where they had a TV commercial planned for September 12th to be released in Japan. And that game is about, flying airplanes and, air combat and stuff like that. So they decided to suspend the commercial and not air it, even though it was just a 15-second commercial about, flying in the air. It didn't really have anything to do with a city or anything. Forward a little bit, they did have an image prepared that they were going to use for advertising as well, where it would show like a sinking aircraft carrier, and the aircraft carrier, it was burning, there was like smoke in the sky, and in the background you could see a city, and like the black smoke and the city in the background kind of resembled the day of the 9/11 attacks in New York. So they decided to alter the image and remove the city out of the background. And I couldn't find the original image. I can only find the altered image. But they would also explain this on Twitter later, saying that it was just a coincidence and, it had nothing to do with the September 11 attacks. They just coincidentally had the city that had all this black smoke in front of it around the time of the 9/11 attacks as a promotional image drafted up. And, then they would change it out once, they felt like it was insensitive at the time.
So this next one, I was unsure if I should include it, but I think it does fit into this. But Hitman 2 Silent Assassin from 2002 kind of falls into this. Maybe it's a little bit like that, that Syphon something 3? Well, Syphon Filter 3, where it's not directly connected, but I think just the anxiety that was global at that point, where like even game developers were tiptoeing around like what they wanted to do with games. So in Hitman 2 Silent Assassin, there is a mission where you go to a Sikh temple in India, and there's essentially a Sikh extremist cult, and like you have objectives based off of that. During 2001, there was a lot of Islamophobia because of the religious nature of like the terrorist attacks. But there was also a lot of ignorance about like religions in general, and not saying that like random Islamic person should receive backlash for what happened, but the Sikh Indians, who are a completely different religion, they just happen to also have brown skin and wear turbans, also received a high amount of backlash and hate during this time. And that level did maybe come across as a little bit insensitive. It was making this group seem like an antagonistic terrorist group during a time where they were receiving that backlash already because of the 9/11 attacks. So in an update to the game and future releases of the physical copies of the game, all Sikh imagery would be removed from the game. Also, there was a racial slur, borderline racial slur in the game also that would get removed as well, where one of the characters refers to the Sikhs as towel heads.
Oh.
Yeah, pretty wild. They removed it. Now, interestingly enough, if you buy the game on like Steam, you'll have that updated version with all of the religious imagery removed from the game. But if you buy it on GOG, you still get the original version, racism and all. So it's just an interesting story, because I feel like that's something that's often overlooked, especially if you didn't grow up in like the early 2000s, or you weren't around during the early 2000s. You probably don't understand how the anxiety was in America. But like, there definitely were people out there who would be like scared to sit next to a Sikh person on an airplane because they're wearing a turban. So I understand why the decision to make an extremist terrorist group in a video game be Sikh kind of come across as like insensitive towards those people who are receiving extra scrutiny randomly. So yeah, it's a touchy topic, I guess, but I'm trying to do it justice, but maybe I'm not wording it the best way. But I think most of the people watching will understand what story I'm trying to explain here.
Yeah, at the end of the day, people were so ignorant that they thought, there was no difference between, certain religions. I'm
not trying to say like Islamic people or Muslim people are all terrorists or anything like that, right? But when there was all this anxiety, inherently, the Sikh people were just like catching strays on top of everything else.
Right. Yeah. A lot of Muslims were catching strays, and then the Sikh people were catching strays. Like
it was a wild time, and a lot of people maybe don't remember that, but I don't know, if you're around during that time, I'm sure you experienced it to some point too. So apparently also, Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Rogue Spear, which obviously is like a counter-terrorist game, had a mission where there were hostage situations on airplanes. These would end up being altered or removed ultimately. I've seen some gameplay on like on airplane level back in the day, so I think maybe some of it was restored or some of it still exists to an extent. Obviously, plane would be brought back in Rainbow Six Siege from where it was originally. But kind of interesting. That game came out in 2001, so it makes sense why some stuff would be altered there as well.
Yeah, and I guess it's interesting that because like a couple years later, we would see plane levels regularly again, right? Like with COD 4, you had what's it called, Mission or Team Expendable? What was the
Mile High Club?
Oh, Mile High Club, that was the name. Yeah, and like stuff like that. It would definitely swing back again.
Those levels were like borderline controversial too, though. They were like,
right,
oh wow, they're doing this with their campaign. Like that's kind of ballsy to do that. Same with Modern Warfare 2, even doing the terminal airport level, right? Like that was controversial because it was such a sensitive topic still 8 years later. There was a couple other games that had like some adjustments. Max Payne, originally the PC version, had the World Trade Center and some billboards and cutscenes. They would be removed though in the PlayStation 2 and Xbox ports of the game, which came out in December of 2001. Also Wheeler, American Pro Trucker from 2000, originally released in arcades, and they had the Twin Towers in it. However, when the game would release on the PlayStation 2, the towers were removed from the game as well.
Also, during the development of Half-Life 2, which wouldn't release until 2004, they initially, before 2001, had a level planned where a plane would crash into a high-rise. And during the 20th anniversary documentary, they revealed that they decided to cut it after 9/11. And I mean, we don't have any real visuals on it, but you know, the developer said it was supposed to happen like that. And obviously, they couldn't pull it off.
This one's just a report, but Red Faction in 2001, its marketing campaign was apparently dialed back a bit to reduce certain explosions and destruction sequences for the sake of not seeming insensitive during that time.
Have you ever heard of the game Savage Skies? That's probably a redundant question because I doubt anyone has ever heard of that game.
No, I don't know that.
It is like a fantasy combat flying simulator. You fly on like monsters. They like breathe fire or shoot something like much like that free game we played at one time with the dragons.
Oh, the one that gets like released like every week on Xbox.
Yeah,
they
yeah.
like do a new bundle and it gets to the top of the new page.
It was much like that, and that one released in March of 2002. But originally, this game was supposed to be way different, and it was supposed to be a tie-in with Ozzy Osbourne of all people. And the original title for the name was Ozzy's Black Skies, which, you know, that was kind of an interesting name choice, but obviously they picked the name prior to the attacks, so they didn't know. But after the attacks, they would end up completely reworking the game. Ozzy Osbourne would drop from the project, even though he had already made music for the game as well. And they would change the name to Savage Skies, and it would become this fantasy game that we ended up getting. Now, this original track that Ozzy Osbourne made for the game called Black Skies, which would have been the title track, he would release it on like a bonus track on some albums released in some regions. So eventually that track would get out there, and we would see, we would be able to, I guess, hear that. There's not much known about the original vision for the game and how Black Skies would have been different from Savage Skies, so I don't know. But also they would end up canceling the Xbox and PC version because of this, and they would just release a PS2 version. But all this stuff was, you know, obviously announced pre 9/11, and then they had to scramble in the couple months they had before release to change everything up and, you know, make it its own thing. So you remember when we talked about Propeller Arena a couple months ago in one of our videos? It was, I think, the one about games you were not supposed to play, like where we talk about leaked builds and stuff, right?
Right.
And that game was a Dreamcast game supposed to release in 2001, like a week after September 11. And the whole game was about airplane fights, and there was like city levels, and you were just like, you know, flying around the city. It was just a crazy concept. So they just decided to cancel the whole game and just be like, nah, we can't pull this off anymore. I mean, the Dreamcast is already in a bad spot. Nah, this is not gonna help. So the whole game ended up being canceled, even though it was 100% finished. And, you know, there is builds out there that got leaked later on. You can play the full game. This was a fully finished game that was completely canceled because of 9/11. This is what Osama took from us. I think I'm gonna cut that line, but
No. Keep it. Well, I think those were the main games that we wanted to talk about for this video. Weird topic for us to try to cover here, but we really did want to talk about it because I do think there's a significance about gaming and this time period, because look at all these things that were affected. If you enjoyed this video, a subscription or a like goes a really long way, surprisingly, especially if you're watching on television. But anyways, if you want to see content like this, we upload this type of format, long form, about every week. So we appreciate it. Also, huge shout out to our patrons making videos like this specifically possible. We're going to try our best not to get demonetized, but you never know with YouTube. So, throwing $5 our way does go a really long way. That's like nowadays cheaper than a cup of coffee. So if you guys want to help us out, maybe check out our Patreon. You get like some Discord perks. But it's totally okay if you guys don't. We just appreciate you watching us. So, or YouTube memberships.
yeah, don't forget about the YouTube memberships. You know,
YouTube memberships, same thing as Patreon. Either one works, but we appreciate you guys. So, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you guys soon with another video.
Bye bye.